we moved from Marshalltown many years ago to on the outskirts of Marshalltown, technically, but it was between LeGrand and Gilman. Though there was a county road, a paved road running along the side in front of it, it was out in the country. And we moved there to this Quaker congregation. I was going to be pastoring for the next 7 years. At that time, we had King the dog, K-H-I-N-G. King was a chow chow. And we had Binky the cat, mixed who knows what, that we had for quite a while. And Binky the cat, when we had the truck of the farmer that had helped us move in, one of the farmer's trucks, pulled in. It was a kind of a big grain type truck. And unbeknownst to us, Binky had then climbed up into the engine after the truck had come to a halt and turned off. So Binky was up inside. We didn't know it. So when Andy, the farmer, got ready to leave, he started his truck, and the fan blade, something struck Binky. We're not sure exactly what. And Binky went to the ground, but was still alive, but then was so scared that Binky darted off into the adjacent cornfield. We looked for Binky, but in that tall corn, we just couldn't find him. We had no idea where he was. Binky was gone for 3 days. We thought probably he was dead. We just didn't know. But at the end of that 3rd day, Binky came back. I had heard dogs panting a lot in my life. I'd never heard a cat panting for water. Have you ever heard that? I'd never heard it, but cats can pant. Binky the cat was just so thirsty that Binky was panting for water when Binky finally came home. And so you should have seen that cat lapping up that water. So thirsty. Well, Psalm 42 verse 1 says, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. Isaiah chapter 55 verse 1 says, everyone who thirsts, come to the water for free and have your thirst quenched. Talking spiritually. And then Jesus said, really probably in reference to that verse, in John's Gospel chapter 7 verses 37 Jesus, at the last day of the feast, the great day, shouts out, all you who are thirsty, come to me and drink of the water that I shall give. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his or her innermost being shall flow rivers of living. The passage that we're going to look at Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 3 is a passage about thirst, about thirsting God. And it says in verse 7, you guys will advance the slide. Verse 10 says, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. Let's read that together. Help it sink into our thinking. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. Now, what has come before that is Paul is writing to a church that has been affected by, like so many of the church starts that Paul has been starting all across the Mediterranean basin, by Judaizers, people who are Jewish. Some of them have become Christians, but they are wanting Gentiles to live according to the Mosaic law. So they're wanting them to come under the legal system of Judaism. And some of them have accepted Jesus as the Messiah, some of them have not. But Paul warns this church about those people trying to take away your liberty in Christ by having you do a bunch of do's and don'ts. There is the law of Christ, and there is that law of love, and we're to love God with all of our heart and love our neighbor as ourselves. And St. Augustine one time said, love God and do as you please. Well, his point was, when we truly love God, then we are walking in the law of love, and there are certain things we don't do, certain things we will do because of the law of love. Paul says, he goes on to say that, but if you want to brag about all the stuff you've done, now he's talking to Jewish colleagues, if you want to brag about that, all the good works you've done, then I can play that game. And he begins a litany of all the things that he's accomplished and done in Judaism. And he says that I'm of the tribe of Benjamin, I'm a Pharisee, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews, meaning there were some Jewish people who had sort of been assimilated, at least in their language, to the Greek and Roman culture, and they would use that language most of the time. Paul is saying, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews. I've kept the Hebrew language alive. That is my identity, and I've kept that alive in my life. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. But he said in verse 7, all of this stuff that I've done, I consider it nothing compared to the value of knowing Christ. And then he says this, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. I want to know Christ. The word he uses for know is a word that means to intimately experience. Now we can know about things. I was thinking recently, because of this being football season, I became a Packer fan when I was pretty young. And I remember the Ice Bowl. I was 10 years old in 1967, and it was New Year's Eve day when the Green Bay Packers played the Dallas Cowboys in what has famously been coined the Ice Bowl. It was 13 degrees below zero, 15-mile-an-hour winds, making it a chill factor of 38 below. The great middle linebacker, number 66, Ray Nitschke for the Green Bay Packers, got blistered frostbite on 6 of his toes. It was incredibly, incredibly cold. And it came down to the last play of the game. There were 16 seconds left, and the Packers used their last timeout. And they could have kicked a tying field goal, but instead, Vince Lombardi said, we're going to run it in. And Bart Starr went over to him, and he said, because three running backs on each side, 3 fumbles on each Cowboys and Packers that happened that day. 6 fumbles total that running backs had committed because it was just so cold. They could not hold on to the ball. And so Bart Starr told his coach, I don't think we should risk handing it off. I'll run it in. And so Vince Lombardi says the famous line, run it, and then let's get out of here. And he says some expletive. But anyway, so with 16 seconds left in the game, Bart Starr runs back in, and it's a short count, and behind the block of Jerry Kramer, number 64, against number 75, Jethro Pugh of the Cowboys, that famous block. In fact, that's what made instant replay what it is today. That play was seen over and over and over, and NFL Films was born, all of that. So I can go on and on about the details, Gabe, about the Packers winning that game, their 3rd straight national championship. But I wasn't there. I can give you facts about it, and I can get really passionate about it. I wasn't there. I didn't feel that cold. I didn't experience that. I was just watching it as a team. Sometimes the Bible and the information and church and the information can become like stats that we know, and we learn the rhetoric, but it doesn't mean we experience it. And the word that Paul uses, I want to know Christ, is the word for knowing, and it's the equivalent of the Hebrew word that a man would know a woman. Adam knew Eve, and they had Cain and Abel. It is that intimate knowledge, spirit to spirit of God, where we experience God. That's what Paul says. All of this stuff that I've accomplished in the flesh is nothing. I want to know, intimately experience Christ and the power, the dunamis, the dynamic, the dynamite. I want to know the dynamic of the resurrection, that which fills my life with hope, so that no matter what my circumstances are, no matter how death-ridden a circumstance may seem, the resurrection of Christ works within that. I want to know Christ in that way, and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship, the koinonia of his sufferings. Now, on face value, we might think that he's talking about just suffering external bad things or internal oppression or the forces of life that come against us. And certainly he uses words like that in other places, and certainly we are told that there is that kind of suffering that happens to us as Christians. The word he uses here is a word from which we get our word pathos, from which we get our word passion. If you're familiar with the passion of the Christ that we'll talk about during Holy Week, the passion of the Christ, that's where that word comes from, for suffering. It's the idea that yes, we suffer, but it is suffering in the context of such passion to carry out the will of God that the currents we come against, because we have this passion for fulfilling the will of God in our lives. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2 says, fixing your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter or completer of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has been seated at the right hand of the Father. So the idea of this suffering is to enter into his very desire and longing to be pleasing to the will of God. And then he says, being conformed to his death. There is in our Christian life this dying and being raised up. We die to things, and then he brings resurrection in the midst of those things. I learned many, many years ago that in the midst of forest fires, as tragic as those are, that most of the forest fires are started naturally, lightning or other things. And yet, within our system, there's reason for that. There are seeds that are encased in a way that unless you have the forest fire come, those seeds will never sprout. They're just in a hard shell. But the forest fire breaks open those shells, and those seeds begin. And so you have new resurrected life that comes out of even the fire that has laid waste to acres and acres of trees. New life. So Paul is saying, I want to be conformed to this death. And the picture we get, I think, is out of Gethsemane, where Jesus, in that moment of surrender, says, Lord, if this cup can pass from me, so be it. But if not my will, but your will be done. That's being conformed into his death. Having said all of that, Paul really raises the bar. How do we, as Christians, living out our daily lives in 21st century America, how do we learn to even start walking that way? I mean, we come to Jesus, we talk about him being our Savior and Lord, but how do we implement this kind of a mindset into our daily lives? Well, it helps if we have a pattern to go by. This next passage, Paul says this. This next passage, there we go. Beloved, he says, chapter 3, verse 17, Beloved, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. For I've told you often before and say it again with tears in my eyes that there are those, many whose conduct shows they are really enemies of the cross of Christ, who set their minds on earthly things, for our citizenship is in heaven. I want us to focus on that. Observe those who walk according to the pattern. I was thinking about a couple of examples that could share what that might mean. Let's say that I was asked by one of our wood craftsmen. We have about a half dozen people in this church at least who are really skilled. We have a new Advent candle on a stand that we just got. Memorial Committee just purchased it. It's back in one of the offices. You'll see it. It's Advent season. It's beautiful. And it came in a kit that had to be put together. And for some reason, the Memorial Committee did not call me to put that kit together. Instead, they called Don Harvey to do that. I was thinking, Don, in fact, last night I hurt my thumb just a little bit. I had to have a couple bandages on it. And I thought, it would just sound so macho if I could get up here and say, yeah, I was out in the wood shop doing a project, and yeah, it jagged it a little bit with a circular saw. It just sound macho, Matt, if I could say that. But you know how this happened is I was just trying to tuck the sheet in under the mattress, and there was a little nail or something scratched me. I know it. This doesn't swim the same. So let's say that a carpenter who's really a master carpenter wants to hire me or something, and I'd say, okay, that'd be cool. I can dig that, and he goes through the tools and how you use things, how you make measurements. And I say to him, well, I've got a hymnal, and that's close, that's almost 12 inches. I mean, that just eyeballing it, it's about a foot. And so I'll just use that. And he says, well, listen, the stuff you've got to do, it has to be exactly 10 foot by 3 feet, and you've got to make this exactly to specs. I'll be fine. I'll just use a hymnal. And if a master carpenter, if I were to take that kind of a glib attitude about something as precise as measurements, what would he think about it? What do you think? Would he think I'm ignorant? Maybe. Would he think I'm arrogant? Yeah, to think that I can just do it this way, it'll be just fine. Sometimes we kind of have the idea that we can just do this Christian life on our own. It's sort of like, we've got our hymn. I worship God when I fish. But there's nothing wrong with fishing. We're worshiping God. But if it's likened unto some areas where we really have to have some mastery and expertise, just fishing and worshiping God out there doesn't necessarily teach us some of the precise things, but we have to know to have a pattern to grow in Christ in the most proficient way. Or change analogies. For a while the kids were in junior high, the older kids in junior high, I coached basketball. I'm going to tell you up front, I was lousy. I never liked to do it, but I wanted to take my turn like parents do, and they asked me if I would do it, so I did it. I learned something about junior high kids in practices. They all want to shoot the ball. Come to practice, and given their druthers, they just want to shoot. Right? They'd spend the whole practice time just shooting the ball. And it's like some of us as Christians. Well, we just kind of want to do the stuff that feels good to us, that we get excited about, we want to do. We just want to shoot the ball, whatever that may mean in our Christian life. But as a coach, I'd have to get them to do stuff that they really didn't find very exciting. We'd have to do running drills. Learn how to play defense. We'd have to learn how to pass the ball. Just some basic things that if they wanted to have any chance to do well in the against the opposition, they would have to learn that. Because even though they might be a terrific shot, if they didn't know how to guard, if they didn't know how to get their body in front of someone without just using their arms, they could call fouls all the time, if they didn't know how to do lots of things, and if they didn't learn how to play as a team, then they would lose. No matter how individually good they might be in shooting during practice time. Well, that made me think about a person that I have such admiration for, and I've talked about him before, but John Wooden. John Wooden was the coach of UCLA for many years, and the UCLA Bruins, our own Lynn back there, Lynn, wave your hand, that's her favorite team out in California. And he was the coach of the basketball team, the UCLA Bruins. He started there, I think, in 1948. And at that time, it was not an enviable job to have, but he took it. The first thing he did was start to instill some discipline. No cussing and no criticizing of other players. Pretty basic. No cussing, no criticizing of other players. 18 years later, he began a run of 10 national championships, 7 national championships in a row. That's unheard of. It's amazing that someone can do that. John Wooden had basic patterns that he taught his players. And if you will follow these patterns, then you will succeed in not only basketball, but in your life. When Mr. Wooden would conduct basketball workshops, he always started the same way. He taught every young person who came to that how to put on his or her socks. That was what he did. Because his point was, most people who are athletes don't know how to put their socks on. Well, what do you just pull them up? And that's how sometimes people think about Christian things. Well, you just pray, just do that, just pull them up. No. If you don't work them up precisely just in the right way, when you're out on the court, you're going to get blisters. And if you get blisters, you're not going to play at 100% because you're going to lose. And so he would meticulously teach them how to put on a pair of socks. And that's where the pattern. And he would go on to win 10 national championships because he taught people some patterns of how they were to live their life, not just play basketball. As Christians, we need that. If you go to this last slide, I want you to consider a couple of questions as we think about patterns for apprenticeship. has been your pattern for following Christ? Who has been your pattern in your life? Who has been that carpenter, if you will, or that basketball coach? That person who, relating it to spiritual things, has been someone who has taught you the discipline from which we get our word discipleship, the discipline of following, what it means to follow Christ. For many of us, we've not had that strong person in our lives, so we've sort of just grown up, spiritually speaking, just going to the gym and shooting baskets, thinking, well, that's what we call Christianity. There's so much more. But for many of us, we've not had the mentors or listened to the mentors who would teach us patterns of how to excel in a greater way as citizens of the kingdom of heaven. I was very blessed. Not only a mom who was my mentor and a dad who was mentor and great support, but I had people early on when I was called into ministry who helped me, and I knew enough to listen to them. My first pastor, and we've got one of the parishioners. In fact, two of the people so influential in my life, two couples, one of the gentlemen is here today, Wayne Norton and Sharon Norton, who's gone home to be with the Lord, and Edwin and Sue Burgett, who were my first youth leaders. So between those families and Reverend Gerald Cochran, that became my initial mentoring, where I would learn the pattern. Reverend Cochran, he was not by the world standards a well-educated man, but he had such a passion for Jesus, and that's who I learned that initial passion from. And we would gather in a circle of prayer with our youth group, and he would say, "Precious Jesus," and you would just feel the presence of the Spirit. And he could talk to me about things that maybe other people wouldn't. There was a time in my early Christian ministry, we put together a singing group. And during that time, there were like a bazillion singing groups out there. And the person that came to our church some, his name was Tim Peterson, and his group was called the Samaritans. Tim Peterson was a big guy. You know, all of us younger ones just would look up at him and like idolize him. His hair was perfect, and he was just a big guy, and he had this great big deep voice. And he talked sort of like this: "My name's Tim Peterson. We travel the gospel circuit 365 days." That's sort of how he sounded. And so I started trying to be like Tim Peterson, talk like Tim Peterson. And so I did that once, and my pastor heard, Pastor Jerry came up to me afterwards. He said, "Listen, God already has a Tim Peterson, but he doesn't have it. That's who he needs you to be." Proverbs says that the rebuke of a friend is better than the flattering lips. I needed that word, even though it kind of hurt at first. I needed that word for my pastor to speak to me, to help me understand the pattern that I need to let Jesus do through me what he wants to do. I also had within that first congregation a retired English teacher named Mr. Holland. And Mr. Holland, I just looked up to him so much. And also Mr. Senor, who taught the senior citizens class. Instead of going to the youth class on Sunday mornings, I sat with all the white-haired people and some blue-haired folks in Mr. Senor's senior citizens class. And it was a lecture class, and I would just sit there and soak it in. But Mr. Holland, this retired English teacher, I asked him, because I first started speaking at 16, and I would, in those days, 5 minutes I'd speak from, as I told you, from Genesis to Revelation. And yes, I know for the good old days, but you wish they were here again. But anyway, but as I was learning in the process, I said to Mr. Holland, "Would you let me know if I make a grammatical error? If I need to say something differently, because I want to learn to communicate better." And so he would give me little hints and things that I could do in the group. What was I doing? I had found someone whose pattern I could follow as I was developing in my life. We need that as Christians. So who has that been? And if you don't have someone, who might you find that you realize for your personality, for your situation in life, this person can help me live out my life? Oftentimes we need that in family situations. So many, many times I've looked at mentoring families to think, how would they do this? And we've been blessed to see families and think, okay, here's how I want to raise my kids, like they're raising their kids, and things like that. You find people that you can borrow their pattern and become better in whatever area you're in. So who has been your pattern for following Christ? And then lastly, for whom are you a pattern? That's the one that sometimes keeps you awake at night, praying, thinking, I need to be an example. So who are you a pattern for, or for whom are you a pattern? Who would like you to be a pattern? And how does that cause you to elevate your game, if you will, to being a pattern in other people's lives that, like Paul said, follow my example? At one time when I would read that, it kind of felt a little arrogant on Paul's part, but I've come to think, no, I think that's true. If Don Harvey were to say to me, Richard, when you do this with a lady, you need to follow my example on this, because he's assuming, rightfully so, I would know nothing about what I'm doing. So he would say, Richard, you need to do it this way. Is that arrogant? No. It's a man who understands how to work with wood. So Paul is someone who understood something of walking and following with Jesus, walking with him and following him. So he's saying, follow my example, not because I'm a substitute for Jesus or substitute for God, but because through experience, knowing him, I've learned how to run a lathe. I've learned how to deal with difficult circumstances, to be in prison and maintain my faith, to interact with people and to live in Christ, follow my example. So I want to pray that God would not only help us to find patterns in other people's lives, but that we would become powerful patterns for others. Lord, thank you for those people that probably have come to many of our minds as we've thought about who's been a pattern of following Jesus in our lives. We thank you for raising those people up in our lives to create patterns of success in walking with Jesus. And Lord, we pray that we would become powerful patterns for our children, for fellow students, for friends and colleagues, for people with whom we come in contact. God, make us patterns for Christ, because we want to know you, the power of your resurrection, and the fellowship of your sufferings, being conformed to your death. In Christ's name.